guest on Vinyl and Vision.
Hello, folks. Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Vinyl and Vision. Here we are with episode 104. Today's very special guest is Sean Pryor, guitarist of Intercourse from Connecticut. Intercourse is a noise rock hardcore band from the Connecticut area. I got to see Intercourse perform opening up for Piss Jeans at the Space Ballroom in Hampton, Connecticut, I believe it was. Very cool space, very cool spot, and they were a great show. It was a great show to see. Intercourse has a new album out currently called Halo Castration Institute, available through Learning Curve Records. I really loved having Sean on the show today to discuss an album that was important to him, being Slint's Spiderland. Very, very weird, difficult record. I love it. I love that record, actually. I mean, I've been a fan of it as well for a very long time. We do discuss that in the episode, but difficult to talk about. You know, there is certainly more information about that band and that record available currently in 2023, though still not a lot, and still not like really great pertinent information. So I did the best I could. It turned out pretty great still. Sean was very, very kind, very thoughtful in his answers and his decorum, speaking with me today and sharing a lot about kind of his own personal history and what it's like to be in Intercourse currently. They have a couple of shows coming up, great shows opening up for some awesome bands. Chat Pile Nerver is coming up. So I will provide links in the show notes to find those tickets, whether it be through their websites or so forth. You can do that, pick up those tickets to those shows. Those actually might sell out, so you might want to get those quickly. And also pick up, links will be provided for their new album, Halo Castration Institute, available on Learning Curve Records. If you care to know a little bit more about us and what we do here at Psychic Static, please go to www.psychicstatic.net and make a purchase at that website. Anything that is available through there, merch, records, bunch of stuff is available through that website, and it all goes to funding the show and making this possible. So we would really appreciate that. We thank you very much, and enjoy. Hi, Sean. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Doing okay. You're in Connecticut. Which city are you in?
I'm actually in Massachusetts. I'm just outside of Worcester.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But the band is you're in Intercourse, and Intercourse is from Connecticut, correct?
Yeah. So I used to live in Connecticut. I'm born and raised there. I moved to Worcester in like early 2019, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, me and Pete, the bass player, moved up here in like early 2019. Actually, before we were even in Intercourse.
Weird.
Yeah.
So, so you said you were originally from Connecticut?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which city were you in? Were you born in, raised in?
I was born in Manchester, Connecticut, but I grew up most of the time in East Granby, which is right by the airport. This is the only way I know how to describe it, where people know where I'm talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So so what was that like growing up in that area?
It's a weird place, especially the time I grew up there, because, and I'm sure this is the case with probably a lot of like small suburb bordering on rural almost communities in Connecticut, at least, where like on the surface it looks really like idyllic, you know, classic, like, you know, family homes, kids, white picket fence, whatever. But at least growing up there, like as I started to leave, I'm 30. So by the time like I was starting to graduate high school and stuff, there was a lot of like drugs running through the school, which I think from what I've heard from a lot of people in Connecticut seems to be the way that it goes in the suburbs. So it had this kind of like weird dichotomy where you look at it on the surface and it's very like idyllic looking. You know, it was a small school. Like I graduated with like 80 something kids.
Oh, wow, that is small.
Yeah, I think it's the smallest public high school in the state, I want to say.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, so I grew up with like very few people, and like even smaller as the grades went on. And just every couple of years you hear like, oh, this kid, got arrested, got into drugs, whatever. It's like a running cycle.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I guess that is common, pretty common. I mean, it's not my understanding, or at least not my experience, but I mean, I definitely have heard that some of the more white collarish or high blue collarish family neighborhoods tend to, for some odd reason, uh, you know, uh, kind of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Not promote, but it um, like
Yeah.
draw in a lot of drug use for some reason. It's weird.
Yeah. It's always something that I've wondered about. And like, I don't know. I always had like, I'm assuming all the kids that like, had after school activities and stuff like that were probably doing all right. It's the kids that like don't have the money to like keep up, at
Mm,
after school activities. Like they, single parent house, they don't have somebody who can pick them up from soccer practice. I think it's that kind of thing that like the boredom sets in.
yeah. No direction either,
Yeah, exactly.
or lack of direction, I guess.
Yeah, that seems to be the way that it goes. It
Hmm.
doesn't, it's weird. Like half the people I feel like I went to school with are just like straight and narrow, like, go to college, get a job in an office, like real, just normie stuff. Like, nothing wrong with that. But, and then the other half, it's just like, yeah, we never saw that kid again. It's really weird.
Hmm. Okay. Well, let's get into your history. So, what was your household like growing up?
For sure. Yeah. So, all that to say, like, I grew up in a single parent household in a condo, like,
Hmm.
so I definitely didn't have the prototypical experience, I feel like, of a lot of people that lived in my like general area. But I was always like, so yeah, with that whole thing, I was always just pretty much left to my own devices. And for me, that was like, hanging out and listening to bands and stuff. I'm young enough where like I had like pretty unfettered access to like, the internet
Hmm.
from probably like late middle school on. So for me, it was just like every day get home from school and it was just like deep dive on music like all day, every day for me, pretty much.
Yeah. And all kind of self-guided? Like, did you have anyone that was kind of introducing you to anything and kind of like turning you on to music?
So it's weird. My parents, like, I started getting into music like even before that. Like, I was probably like 12, 13 when I first got into like, I think the first bands I really got into as a kid were like Nirvana and REM. And those are two bands that my parents liked because my mom is fairly young. She had me when she was like 25. So I was born in 93. So like by the time I was born, all of that stuff was already like popping off. So by the time I got into it in like the early mid 2000s, my mom was like, "Oh yeah, I know all this stuff. You should listen to this. You should check this out." So that was like a big one for me, my mom. And I had a couple of friends at the time who like were similarly like into music. So there was a lot of like, "Oh, have you heard this band? Have you checked this out?" type of thing.
Yeah. No siblings though, huh?
I have a younger brother, but it's funny. Not really a huge like music guy like I am. Grew up
Hmm.
in the same household, but like he just wasn't as into it. Like the first concert I ever went to, I think I was like 12, and the first one he went to, he was like, I don't know, like 21 or something.
Okay, but he's younger than you. How much younger is he than you?
He's 3 years younger than me.
Oh wow. So it was a pretty significant time period that he was not trying to get involved in music at all.
Yeah, yeah. He had, I don't know, maybe it was like seeing me get into it. He was like, "Oh, I'm not going to do what my older brother did," uh,
Sure.
which is probably good for him that he's not a touring musician. It's funny. A couple of weeks ago, he told me he was like, "Oh, I went to go see the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and I think I want to play bass." And I looked at my phone and I was like, "After seeing everything I've done as like a DIY musician, you want to get in on this racket at like
Yeah.
25, 26, however old he is?"
Yeah, yeah, right. That's weird. Yeah, he's maybe a glutton. Maybe he
Yeah,
he just kind of I don't know. I don't know what else he's interested in, but I mean, it's nice to have a passion. it's cool that he's interested in it, but yeah, I probably just similar to you, I would probably say you might want to just kind of consider a hobby.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was like, buy a video game console, do anything. Don't play music live, whatever you do.
Right, right. Well, I mean,
Like
like play music too, I mean, go ahead and get the instrument, play something, play along with covers and whatever kind of makes you happy, but yeah, don't try to pursue it as a career. That's not a great idea.
yeah, yeah. I was like, I'll give you whatever you need. You need a practice amp. You need a crappy old bass. I'll give you whatever you need. Please don't do what I did.
Yeah. Well, that's very nice of you to be a very good influencing big brother.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just hoping to steer him in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, okay. I hope wish you well on that as well because I know from my own experience it's not a great one.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
um, so yeah. So now I asked you on to speak about an album that was important to you,
Yeah.
and so you chose Slint's Spiderland,
Yes. Yeah.
which knowing at least one of the bands that you're part of, like Intercourse currently is your most current project, your most
Yep.
current band. It seems like a weird choice, and
Yeah.
because the music that Slint made on Spiderland specifically is not a very obvious kind of connection to what Intercourse's music is like. And I know that influence does not necessarily mirror art.
Yeah.
Okay, and in most cases it isn't obvious. So I don't think that it's weird in that situation. But I mean, with this being said, I mean, what do you think that this album rubbed off on you?
So yeah, that was the thing that I was trying to think about when I was trying to pick an album because I ran through like, my list of favorite records of all time.
Sure.
I was like, there's plenty of these that I love. I know every song, like the back of my hand, but I can't honestly say that it's influenced the way that I approach music or the way that I write songs.
Hmm.
And I was trying to think of records that were maybe formative in my early years. And I was like, do I still listen to these records a ton? Like I mentioned, like being really into like Nirvana and REM. Nirvana is like one of the reasons why I picked up guitar, which I think is, true of a lot of people.
Sure.
I can't say that I'm like, I get into the car in the morning and I'm like, oh, I got to listen to In Utero right now as a 30-year-old. Like it's obviously like its impact is huge on me, but
Hmm.
it's not one I find myself continuously listening to.
Sure.
And I think I picked this record because it hit that sweet spot where I'm like, I still listen to this record. It was huge on me when I first heard it. And it's still a record that like, I don't, primarily what I write in the band is music. I don't write lyrics really. And I'm like, my instrument is guitar. So that's the way that I write songs.
Hmm.
And this is a record that I look at and I'm like, oh yeah, I can hear a lot of the way that I like approach guitar, the way that I approach songwriting on this record.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
From what you were saying, the way you were describing that experience, especially your when you're saying you write,
Mhm.
it sounds like you write stuff aside from what you do with Intercourse. Is that true?
At this point, like I used to a lot more than I do now. I think we're more, at least in Intercourse now, we're more of a like well-oiled machine where it's like a lot of what all of us do has been Intercourse for at least the last like year or two, I want to say.
Hmm. Okay.
And a lot of my like guitar playing approach is where Spiderland comes in. I feel like, at least in the songs in the band that I have written.
Yeah.
So I write as far as writing the music in Intercourse goes, it's kind of a free for all. I think everybody kind of does it, and then Rick comes in and writes all the lyrics. Um, yeah,
Rick Tarek.
yeah, Tart. Yeah,
You call him Rick for short. Okay. Just wanted to be
yeah,
clear because
yeah.
all right. Well, so let me share this quote with you. Britt Walford says of Brian McMahon, two of the members of the band, obviously, and basically the backbone of Slint, which has been corroborated by David Pajo, the guitar player of the band. So Britt says we were listening to a lot of music, but usually separately. Jad Fair was a big one for me. The Frogs, AC/DC, The Stooges, Suicide. He was listening to Neil Young and Nick Drake's Pink Moon. End quote. So, can you tell me about some other things that have influenced you for the making of the last intercourse record, Halo Castration Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting that they say that because I sort of feel like when we all get into a room together to write songs or to, polish off songs that have already been written, that does seem to be like the same kind of thing that we all do, where someone will come in and be like, "Oh, I have a bass line and it reminds me of this band." And like, I know our bass player Pete, big Brian Cook from Botch, and Russian Circles and These Arms Are Snakes, huge influence. So he'll come in with that perspective, and that's the thing that we all really enjoy, but maybe are not the musical influences we draw from. So it sort of has that same vibe where everyone's pulling from different things
Hmm.
to sort of create this amalgamation of a song.
Yeah. Right. So, so what would you say are some of your influences that kind of like you look to for
Right.
guitar work?
Yeah, for me, some of my biggest guitar heroes are not always necessarily. I always feel that pull between like who's a great guitar player and who's like an interesting guitar player. And I
Hmm.
tend more often than not to go for who's interesting over who's like, technically proficient.
Sure.
So a bunch of my huge influences, especially in this band, have always been noise rock. I know we sort of straddle the line between like heavy hardcore stuff and noise rock, but my perspective is always like people like Steve Albini is a huge influence on me. Dave Pajo's guitar playing is huge for me. My first like original, and you won't hear it at all in Intercourse, was Johnny Marr from the Smiths. Was one of those as a kid where I was like, oh, I need to figure out how this works. I need
Hmm.
to, yeah, I really need to like strap in and sort of understand how he writes music.
Yeah, yeah. So that was that more of like at least the Johnny Marr thing.
Mhm.
Was that more of like when you were learning, and so that you kind of like were trying to figure out the maybe the basics of guitar playing?
Yeah, yeah, definitely in high school when I was a lot younger, I was huge into the Smiths, like late high school, and I was like, I've been playing guitar for a couple years, but not in any way seriously at that point. And I was like, I had heard the Smiths, and I was like, oh, I have to. I think a lot of musicians have this thing where they hear something that they haven't heard before or in a way that they've never heard before and like instantly want to like tear it apart and find out how it works. And that's how I
Hmm.
felt the first time I heard a lot of Johnny Marr's guitar playing.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess maybe as an early learner, not just you specifically, but
Mhm.
anyone that's kind of getting into an instrument, you kind of want to emulate. You find someone that you want to kind of basically figure out exactly how they do it and then sound like them even.
Big time. Yeah, that was huge for me. Especially in that period. It was for me, it was all like classic alternative bands at that time. I was really into like Sonic Youth and Dinosaur Jr. and the Pixies at that point.
Hmm.
And the Smiths are like a logical progression to that. And I'm sure if there were any surviving like old demos of anything I had written in high school, it all just sounds like worship of those couple of bands.
Hmm. Yeah. So you think your playing and your writing has progressed significantly and like very drastically from that to where you are now?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the last couple of years, I think I've definitely I feel like there's a point where you turn a corner and you, at least in growing up, getting older, you feel like, oh, I don't feel like an amateur at this anymore, or I don't feel like I'm doing this for fun. I feel like I maybe it's a confidence thing. I'm like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I know how to approach this. I know how things happen, and I think a lot of that, um, at least for me, removes a lot of that like conscious thought where you're like, I have to sit down and I have to figure out what I'm writing right now. You can kind of put that part of your brain on autopilot and sort of like know that no matter what happens, like you'll figure something out. I think
Mm.
is where I've gotten to in my songwriting, at least in the
Yeah,
last
yeah.
couple of years.
And you've also kind of developed your own sound, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Or at least I like to think so. Um, I think in a lot of ways, at least someone like me who writes music, I'm sure it's probably true of people who write lyrics as well. My personal style does kind of feel like an amalgamation of all those influences, but just put through my own lens. Like I can hear things that I do and think, oh, I have an idea of where like this style of guitar playing came from.
Hmm.
Not necessarily, that it's a copy or a clone or whatever, but just like, oh, I can see like even since I picked this, I was re-listening to Spiderland a bunch. And I was like, oh, I can see where a lot of these riffs like dug into my brain, and I can hear the way that some of them are articulated is the way that I tend to like articulate certain parts of music.
Yeah, yeah, kind of subconsciously kind of wormed their way out of your fingers.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, there's plenty of like songs I'm like, oh, I do that.
Hmm. Have you learned any of this music? Because I'm not really big on like learning how to play covers and specifically stuff like this that seems so like kind of jarring. Like it's not
Yeah,
like I'm not a very skilled guitar player, so the idea of trying to learn something that's not very kind of like basic progressions and basic root chords
yeah,
just seem completely like foreign to me. Like there's no way I'm going to figure that out.
for sure. Yeah, there's a couple of songs on this record that I know that I have definitely learned at one point. I think that's the first song, Breadcrumb Trail. I put it on and I was like, oh, this is one of those riffs that like if I pick up a guitar, anywhere that I am in my own house, like at a guitar store, I'm like, this riff will probably come out at some point.
Hmm.
I know how to play that riff like the back of my hand.
Yeah, that's your stairway to heaven.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. It's like that and a couple of other like go-to riffs where I'm like, you could like wake me up at 2 in the morning and I hand me a guitar and I was like, this is probably what's gonna come out, like not thinking.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. Now how did you find this record? Like when did you get turned on to this?
This record for me was a big record in college. I want to say like early college, like freshman, sophomore year, something like that. I had right at the end of high school, I had started to get into punk in the way that, a lot of people do, where, those classic bands like Misfits, Black Flag, Descendants, stuff like that is what I first started to get into after moving through like a lot of indie rock stuff.
Hmm.
And a lot of my musical journey for me has been primarily like online, which I think is like, a relatively recent phenomenon, is just like being in music forums or, just talking to people on the internet and like, what are the classic albums like in indie alternative punk music? And this album came up a lot.
Hmm.
And I was familiar with this band through like I've been a real like obsessive about Steve Albini's work, and I know he produced the first Slint record. So as soon as someone was like, "Oh, you should really listen to Spiderland," I was like, "Oh, why do I know that band name?" And I was like, "Oh, first album produced by Steve Albini. Yeah, I'll definitely give this band a shot."
Oh yeah. Okay. So wait, so did you hear Spiderland before you heard Tweez?
Yeah, yeah. I was actually like, I had listened to Tweez like much later. I think I had a harder time finding it at the time,
Hmm. Okay.
like in the early 2010s.
All right. Well, now it should be said, 2010s. 2010s is when you think you found Tweez, but you found Spiderland before that.
No, sorry, other way around. I think I ended up listening to Tweez like after college. So I graduated college like 2015 ish.
Oh, okay. Wait, but so you already had heard Spiderland,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah, yeah,
freshman year, kind of early college years.
yeah,
That's weird that it took you so long to get Tweez, especially with the internet being prevalent. I mean, like
yeah.
there was no streaming service at that time to kind of just.
I don't have it now, but I remember Spotify became a thing. Like I was like a sophomore or a junior in college, and in that back then it was like in beta you had to have like an invitation code. So back then it
Oh,
was
okay.
still like you got to buy it on iTunes or
Oh, right, right.
Yeah.
Or Napster, kind of like downloader or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have to acquire
Okay.
it somehow.
Right. Wait. So what years were like what year did you discover Spiderland? Like, that early college time?
Yeah, it must have been around like 2011, 2012, I think.
2011, 2012. Okay. So a little over 10 years ago, 11 years
Mhm.
ago, something around that. And and so the band had already been disbanded
Mhm.
for another 10 to
20
11
years,
years by
something
the
like
time you
that.
discovered this album.
Yeah. Hmm.
It's because I think it should be said, it's pretty kind of common amongst the research that I had been doing about this album that the when this album came out in 91,
Hmm.
uh to very little acclaim. Like
Yeah.
this thing has been growing as a word of mouth thing. And I think I know that I read specifically in some articles that probably because of that, at first, word of mouth, it was released, the band broke up, so they didn't do any touring on this album.
Hmm.
And the word of mouth thing was picking up, and then of course with the introduction, or at least the kind of the growing use of the internet,
Yeah.
that became another outlet for them to kind of keep their reach growing further and further. So like you were one of those examples of like somebody that kind of found them due to like the internet. So that's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that time in at least the internet. It feels very recent but also very distant in the sense that like obviously social media had existed at that point, but like there was still music forums and like areas where you could just talk to people about topics like that feels like it has gone away a little bit
Hmm.
since social media. It feels like bulletin boards, chat boards, all that kind of stuff has kind of gone away a little bit. But it was a really interesting time to just sit there with people and discover stuff that like you never would have heard, or I never would have heard of otherwise. Because I, from what I remember, I think a lot of it's been demystified now. But from what I remember, getting into that band and at that time, there was very little information about them. I know there's been like a documentary and they've gotten back together and done like big festival shows and stuff since then. But at that point,
Hmm.
that album really felt like it had like a mythic status. Like
Oh yeah.
this unknown band dropped it, disappeared, no one talked about it hardly for years, and then suddenly it's one of the best records of the 90s is how it felt. And like even though all those people have gone on to do other well-known bands,
Hmm.
it still felt relatively like quiet and unknown at that point.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah, and like that's kind of a big thing that's in debate amongst people that talk about this album, because a lot of people talk about this album and write about it, and I don't know. I think my idea of what maybe kind of happened with them was that, like, because the members of these bands went on to go into some other notable projects, um, I feel like that had something to do with it, because maybe a little bit of like the intrigue that people have about whatever project it was that they went
Yeah.
on to, whether it was like, fans of Tortoise, whether it was fans of Palace Brothers, whether it was fans of the Breeders, you found out about those members and you were like, oh, well, what did these people do before? Or like, it's just that connection where you end up buying records and you kind of like, start to piece the names together, be like, oh, wait, this person was on this album.
Yeah.
When then like, and then of course, like meeting and talking and touring, I feel like,
Right.
they probably got mentioned amongst people, especially amongst, popular musicians, that like, oh, hey, this guy's playing in this band tonight, and he was actually part of this old band, Slint, back in the day.
Yeah.
Like, and then kind of like be like, well, I got to listen to their record, and then probably pick it up just because of association or whatever, like I feel like that's kind of something that had something to do with it, but not entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. I think it does seem anyway, like a genuine case of like organic word of mouth, like a whisper network of, have you heard this? Have you heard this? Like one of those things where like they tell two friends and they tell two friends.
Right, right.
At least that's how it felt like at that time. I don't know like what someone now like getting into that record in 2023 would experience, because there's just, I think there's been in that time a lot of myth making, and there's been a like there's been a documentary about them now, like all
Hmm.
those like you can probably find most, if not all of those members, like on like Instagram, and like ask them about the album if you wanted to. But
Mm.
yeah, back then it was like, you know, relatively unknown, from, or not unknown, but like cult classic, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah, mythic. Like it was hard to find information about it for sure. It still
Yeah.
is. I mean, I had a hard time doing the research for this album. I was just like, kind of came across the same things all the time, and nothing that
Mhm.
seemed kind of like stuff that I like to use. I like to use all this like kind of maybe outsider information, like kind of like really
Yeah.
deep seated stuff, either about the making or the interpretation of the lyrics, something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, just not a lot to go on with this record. Still, even though that they have the documentary, I watched the documentary,
Mhm.
and that was great. But
Yeah.
so no, like we were saying, speaking of kind of word of mouth and learning about music and stuff, like how did you learn about Intercourse?
So I learned about Intercourse. Connecticut's a really small state for music. It's really, I don't want to say insular, because that sounds like it's gate kept, which it really isn't. But at least when I was first starting to get into like going to DIY shows and stuff, there really are only like 10 active bands in the state at any given time, is what it feels like.
Hmm.
And because of that, I feel like this is probably universally true of every like DIY scene. Every drummer's in like 5, 10 bands, because no one wants to play drums, it seems.
Yeah.
So I learned about Intercourse through Caleb, who is the drummer of Intercourse, who, yeah, played in a bunch of different bands that I've played with over the years. And we've always been like friends. We have similar tastes in music, similar interests, stuff like that. And I think that's how I found the band,
Hmm.
is just through knowing them. I don't think any of my old bands ever actually played a show with them, which is funny to think of now, because it's like
Yeah.
such a small state. Like, I feel like if you look at like Connecticut DIY band bills, you're like, oh, those three bands are playing together. But I always played with his other bands.
Yeah. And you were rolling in like the same circle, like the bands you used to be part of were also in the similar kind of hardcore noise vein.
Yeah, so the band that I was in before Intercourse is a band called Maneva. We were like screamo meets post rock, I get post hardcore, post rock type of thing.
Hmm.
Probably the best way that I can describe it.
Okay.
Um, and the funny thing about Connecticut is that like the way that it seems to work, at least the way that I've always noticed that it works, is like if you're heavy bands, there's just a heavy band bill, and if you're like not heavy bands, that's the bill that you go on
Okay.
whenever like a show is thrown, or like a bigger touring band comes through. And so it could be a show where it's like, oh yeah, there's a hardcore band and then a black metal band and then like my band. It was never like, oh, there's the black metal show, there's the doom show. Just
Hmm.
because it's so small. Like if you threw a probably doom only show in Connecticut with locals, I don't know if anybody would show up, or you get like 5, 10 people in the door. So there
Sure.
was kind of like, oh yeah, if you like screamo, you probably like hardcore, you probably like doomier stuff. All those bands will go together, and so that's sort of like the circle that I've always rolled in, as like the heavier side of bands in Connecticut.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. So it's kind of like mixing it up out of necessity more so than like just out of like, taste.
Yeah, it has always been that way. I left Connecticut in 2019, but I still am there regularly and play shows there regularly. It seemed like the younger generation of kids, like probably 5, 10 years younger than me, are really into hardcore now. So there like kind of is a hardcore scene in Connecticut now for
Hmm.
the first
Okay.
time in a while.
Yeah.
But before that, it was really just like a hodgepodge of bands playing with random other bands that like I think really the only thing they share in common is like volume level and use of distortion.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's cool. I mean, I'm glad to hear that it's developing into something. I mean, it's always kind of interesting to kind of get an idea of what another music scene is like, especially Connecticut is very, very mysterious to me. I mean, I'm not that far. I'm in Rhode Island,
Yeah.
and only just recently have I been hearing about Connecticut bands.
Hmm.
Intercourse, Grizzlor,
Oh yeah.
uh, fuck, I was just wearing their shirt yesterday. Killer Kin.
Oh, Killer
Um,
Queen's great. Yeah.
yeah,
Hell
yeah.
yeah.
So, I don't know. Maybe there's an uptick in Connecticut. Maybe there's some more eyes coming to it right now. I don't know. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, honestly. Like there are a lot of great bands from Connecticut like that are still doing it, which is awesome. It's just like sort of I think it's that proximity that it has between like New York City and Boston
Hmm.
and even Providence, which like has always historically had a lot of like weird bands, like weird interesting bands come out of Providence.
Right.
But I think it's far enough away or close enough rather to all of those things, and it hasn't for a long time had like a core musical identity that it feels like the flyover state of New England a lot of the time.
Right, right. Well, I mean, being here in Rhode Island and Providence being the city that bands we usually stop in,
Yeah.
from what I've learned over these years, not only as a music fan living here and being here, but speaking to people also that have been kind of veterans of this music scene.
Yeah.
Back in the day when I was still maybe too young to go out to these shows in the early 90s,
Hmm.
Rhode Island was like the place to be. Like
Yeah.
we had like one major club that everyone knew across the country, and then people wanted to stop in the living room.
Hmm.
And every band would stop here. It's just like, and every night of the week, from what some people have told me, it was just like every night of the week there was a show going on and it was packed. Whereas like now that's not really the case.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you feel the same way about Connecticut. Like, I mean, first of all, Connecticut's so much bigger, the state
Yeah,
alone, right?
for
And
sure.
so then there's a few other cities to stop in. There's
Mhm.
New Haven, probably, New
Yep.
London, probably. And then what other major city in Connecticut do you think might draw?
That's the funny thing about Connecticut is that like we do have those major cities. The every show I've ever played, I mean, I've played a bunch of shows in those cities. Most of the DIY spaces tend to be in the small. Like we had a lot of like house shows for like college kids renting a house and throwing shows. So like you would look at the bill and it would be like, oh, Bloomfield, Connecticut. I have no idea where that is or like
Hmm.
who's living there. And it would just be like some dude's house. Like that's what we got a lot of. Even now, like a lot of the DIY venues in Connecticut have closed in the past couple of years. Even like post COVID, a lot of them have closed in those bigger cities. Um,
Hmm. Okay.
bigger relative to Connecticut, I should say. So it's a really weird state. I don't feel like it operates in the way that most other states do, where like it rallies around like, oh, like you're saying, like Providence is like, yeah, most of the shows would take place in Providence, or I live in Worcester, a ton of shows take place here, or Boston,
Right.
or outside of Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, whatever.
Hmm.
Connecticut was never really like that. Like I've played shows in like Hamden, Connecticut, which is a glorified suburb, a couple in New Haven, weird places like that.
Hmm.
It's sort of this odd vibe where it doesn't tend to rally around like a specific venue, a specific space.
Right. Yeah.
It's really weird. It's a weird place to grow up in like a DIY scene.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, now what year was it that you joined Intercourse?
First show I played with Intercourse, I was a fill-in member, and that was in 2019.
Okay.
And then full on, I think was like a year later.
Okay. So you're fairly new. Was the new record the only one you've been on so far?
No, I'm on the we have three records. I'm on the second and the third one.
Oh, okay. All
Rule
right.
36, and then Halo, the most recent one.
Right.
Mm.
Okay, cool. Um, Great records, by the way.
Thank you.
I got really confused because I was like looking over the discography and I thought that the new one was on Reptilian Records, but it
No,
was only
yeah,
the
the
second one,
previous
was it?
one. Yep.
Yeah.
This most recent one is on Learning Curve.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Now let's see. We were gonna move on. We're gonna go over the album, Slint,
Yeah.
Spiderland.
Awesome.
Before we get into the first song, I have another quote here to share with you from Britt Walford.
Mhm.
Says, Dave started writing a couple songs in previous band Maurice with
Mhm.
clean guitar, and then somehow Ethan Buckler and I had an idea to do a clean band that just sort of sounded like nature. That was our concept. Asked to clarify what it means for a band to sound like nature, he adds, almost sounding like pine trees or something is the best way I could describe it. Just being very sort of resilient sounding, like fresh plants.
Mm. I think that
So
makes a lot of sense. As soon as he said, "Oh, like nature," that instantly made sense to me. I didn't even need him to necessarily clarify.
yeah,
I think
okay,
there's a lot of that, and a lot. Something that I try to take from that band a lot is space. There's a lot of space in their music,
hmm.
and I feel like, at least from my writing, something that I've tried to actively avoid is filling all possible space, which I feel like is a natural tendency of a guitar player. Is like I have to be doing something at all times, whether it's rhythm stuff or a cool like lead part. Something
Right,
that I tried to take from this album a lot is you don't have to necessarily be doing anything, or like if you have something interesting, that's enough. It doesn't
right,
have to be huge and overblown.
and consistent and like kind of like all the way through.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Like
right. So I mean, considering or keeping in mind that quote that I was sharing with you, is there something that you think of when you think about writing for Intercourse? Like something like an objective, like something that you were trying to achieve necessarily.
that's interesting. I know a lot of people that do. I don't necessarily feel like I've ever had that impulse. I feel like I talk to a lot of people in bands, or a lot of creative people in general. Even when like, so I went to film school is what I went to school for, and you get that too, where you get people who like come out with like a mission statement, like I'm trying to do X, Y, and Z with my art. I've sort of never felt that way. I've sort of just felt like I have an impulse to do this, and I trust that impulse. It's never
Mhm.
been for me like I need to show people that I can do something, or that I have like a mission statement. It's always just been for me, at least writing is like a thing that I enjoy. It feels like a puzzle sometimes, where I'm like, I come up with something, and then it's sort of how do I put this puzzle together? How do I make these random pieces of like riffs that I wrote work together?
Mhm.
And in that way, I feel like I've always been more of like enjoying the process, rather than like, here's my final piece, here's my, mission statement, I guess.
Mhm. Okay. All right. Well, let's start getting into this album, I guess.
Yeah.
So Slint Spiderland, only 6 songs on it. One
Yes.
being an instrumental, so it actually leads very little for me to kind of like embellish on, which is good, which is just fine,
Yeah. That's
because it was.
actually something like that I do really love about this record, is it doesn't wear out its welcome,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which is something that I think is really important. That I mean, I don't want to speak for other people, but I don't know if everybody necessarily considers, is like 6 songs, like what, 40, 45 minutes, and then it's done.
Just under like 39.
Yeah, right. Yeah, when I'm like, that's perfect. Like every intercourse record is like that, where it's like a handful of songs, almost never more than 10 ish, and then it's done in like 35 minutes.
Hmm.
that's sort of like been a musical philosophy, I guess you could say, or like a guidepost for me is like, don't wear out your welcome. If everything's good, it doesn't need to be an hour and a half, two LPs, that type of thing.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it all depends, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for for what this album is, I mean, it was incredibly planned out from what I
Mhm.
learned that these guys really rehearsed this music and kind of like went into a weekend session
Yeah.
and were completely prepared, except for like maybe one exception. And I think we'll get into that when I kind of get into every song individually. But let's start with the first song, Breadcrumb Trail.
Yeah.
Now, so this is an interesting story about a boy or a man. It's not really clear which is which, but who goes into a carnival,
Hmm.
finds a fortune teller that it seems that he may be smitten with, and invites her to a roller coaster ride instead of having his fortune read.
Yeah. Yep.
So, and even more interesting about this song than the kind of actual lyrical
Hmm.
depiction of this story is the structure of the song and how it ebbs and flows with the storyline. Have
Yeah.
you've noticed this?
Yeah. That's something that like I was saying before, I don't write lyrics, but I do love the lyrics on this record just because they're so odd. Uh,
Hmm.
I think there's like a little bit on some of the songs about, really classic songwriting topics like, relationships and love and stuff like that. But for the most part, a lot of it is really weird stuff like this, like a song about a fortune teller and a carnival. And it does sort of, I've always gotten the vibe, and I don't know if this is true, that it has always felt to me like those songs were written first and then the lyrics sort of maybe follow them.
The
Is
song, the music.
yeah, the
Yeah,
lyrics tend to follow the music's how it's always seemed to me.
I
And
think you're right about that.
yeah, it's always felt like locked in that interesting way where if they had where I would imagine if they had been lyrics that were imposed on a song, it would feel more like it would completely change the vibe of the song, I think.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean, I definitely did. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I did remember reading in the research that the lyrics were basically the last thing that they did. So, considering the amount of rehearsing that they did per song, and then the lyrics coming in at the last minute, essentially, that would
Mhm.
make sense. And then I think that would mean you're correct.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's good to know. That was always the vibe that I had gotten.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so weird that you think that like you liked the lyrics of this record. I mean, like I remember my first listening experience. I listened to this back in when did I get this record? I want to say it was probably early 2000s that I heard this record
Mhm.
because I'm older than you. I'm 44,
Okay.
43. So I remember 19, 20 years old-ish for
Mhm.
me kind of hearing about Slint for the first time. A roommate of mine actually was from the Chicago area,
Oh,
and
okay.
I remember she had a Tweez record,
Hmm.
and I remember thinking it was so cool, like just like this kind of iconic look of the Saab,
Yeah.
grill on the front cover. So I picked that up first, and then I bought Spiderland shortly after that, I think,
Hmm.
and. I guess I kind of was I guess I was a little misunderstanding. I was kind of confused by it. Like and like the
Yeah.
lyrics are so weird because not like the first album was a better, representation of
Right.
lyrics and songwriting really, but I mean the spoken word kind of aesthetic of the lyrics on this song
Hmm.
and the majority of this record, I never even knew what he was saying.
Yeah.
I didn't read the lyrics until, doing the research for this record to speak with you.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think something that I generally look for in lyrics or even vocals in general is is honestly stuff like this, and maybe it is because this record is really formative for me. Is it I tend to go for, like I was saying before, like what's interesting rather than maybe what's like technically proficient, and just someone like mumbling these like at the time, like listening to it, like half understood like phrases here and there. I was like, oh, I have to like understand what this is.
Hmm.
It like scratches an itch in my brain where I'm like, I need to know how this works. I need to know how they did this essentially.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, weird. So you picked up all of the stuff that I just explained to you kind of just from your own listening.
Yeah, like yeah, I've listened to this record a ton, and there's definitely a few songs where I like where I don't put as much of a emphasis on the lyrics or trying to figure out what they're about.
Hmm.
Like I was just listening to it recently, and I was listening to we'll probably get to it, but Nosferatu Man, and I've always been really smitten with that guitar part, and just this week reading it, I was like, oh, this isn't these are not lyrics that I paid attention to at all, at least in that song.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, speaking of Nosferatu, man, that's the next song. So why don't we go ahead and get into it?
Yeah.
So from what I have, according to genius.com, which I know is not necessarily what people love to refer to, but
Mhm.
it's where I could find some information. The lyrics of Nosferatu Man were heavily inspired by the film and contain vampire-like and horror imagery and fuses its themes. Um, so now you've already said this on a couple of occasions, but I know you're not the singer, and so maybe you don't have any insight into this. But what do you think inspires your vocalist, Tarek?
Yeah, that is something I can speak to a little bit because him and I both share a love of like reading nonfiction a lot of the time. One thing we bonded on like super early in my tenure in the band was read the author John Ronson. I don't know if you're familiar.
No, sounds
Uh,
familiar, but I don't know why.
he wrote the big ones that most people know that he wrote are the Psychopath Test and Men Who Stare at Goats.
Oh, okay.
Uh, but yeah, he's a nonfiction writer, and he has this tendency to just sort of implant himself into these odd niche groups, like psychopaths, or in the case of the Men Who Stare at Goats, like former like I want to say FBI or CIA. I don't remember which one.
Hmm.
He has this tendency to sort of, as a journalist, insert himself into these really odd, strange situations. My favorite book by him is this book Them, um, which came out in the late '90s, I want to say, but it's him um, putting himself into the world of like political and religious extremists, and so he goes and hangs out with like um, some like far right wing separatists, and he puts himself into a situation where he's hanging out with some Islamic extremists, and then there's like some other like political extremists, and obviously does not share positions with these people. But I don't want to speak too much for Rick, but I think that is definitely a position I've noticed a lot in our songwriting is like I'm gonna like I'm going to insert myself into this situation or what have you, into these like potentially like real world situations. We also share a similar, um, and maybe this is like what I was saying, like sort of the oddness of Connecticut, a similar cynicism, I guess you could say, for DIY. And I
Hmm.
think those are two big things that show up in our lyrics quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is pretty clear. Cynicism in general, maybe not necessarily, from my perspective, at least as an outsider listening, not necessarily about your scene or about
Yeah.
Connecticut, but kind of a general disgust or apathy for maybe some kind of American cultures in general.
Yeah, I think that's well observed. I think a lot of our sort of lyrical themes that end up repeating are do have this kind of like I want to in that similar way to those books. I want to say there's sort of like an outsider's looking in perspective of a lot of these weird cultural phenomenons, or we have a couple of songs that are from the perspective of some, or maybe not from the perspective, but sort of tackle these like weird outsider characters, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of that comes from those books and like just growing up with this natural like cynicism, I think, towards a lot of that like in-group behavior that like DIY kind of fosters.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think it's great. I think it's kind of a really interesting kind of humorous take, because
Yeah.
obviously a lot of it is kind of a wink and a nod kind of delivery, and
Yeah.
in some of that,
Yeah,
and
that's
then it's obviously also just kind of compelling because it's like really heavy,
mhm.
abrasive music, and it's like if you're into that type of loud rock music, which I am, it's it's compelling in that regard.
Yeah, yeah, that's sort of always been the thing that we don't want to be jokey, but we definitely don't want like things to be taken too seriously.
Sure.
Uh, I that's sort of it's funny. We joke like all of us have been in other bands. All of us have had, being in a band in a lot of ways is like proximity to people. Like, oh, I know this person, so let's see. They have a bass, um, and so I feel like there's a lot of ego clash in that a lot of the time. And we do joke that like we're as four like individuals in this band very on the same wavelength, which is nice. It's not something we have always experienced in other bands. And I think a
Mm.
lot of it contribute like a lot of that perspective is why that's the case. We all happen to share that perspective.
Hmm. Cool. All right. Well, that's why you guys are in a band together. It's great. All right. Well, let's move on to the next song, Don Aman or
Okay.
Aman. I don't know how people pronounce that necessarily.
I've always done it like it rhymes.
Don
Don.
Aman.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think this is one of those examples that I was telling you about earlier. Dave Pajo learned this song right before recording. So I mean, Britt and Brian had it
Hmm.
right. I mean, I guess Britt was the writer of the song, so he had it, but uh, Pajo's involvement in it kind of came at the very last minute
Hmm.
during the recording session.
That makes a lot of sense actually. I feel like you can kind of hear that. And that's something that I really like in songwriting or music in general. I sort of like the feeling that like something is shaky or could fall apart at any minute.
Hmm.
That's something that I've really always gravitated towards. I think that's a natural like thing that I think a lot of people like in that grew up listening to punk like really like
Sure.
is
Yeah.
that feeling that like this is not polished, like this is very raw, this like could fall apart at any moment. Is something that I've always like really liked. I think um the replacements record Let It Be is really like that. It
Hmm. Oh,
it
yeah.
has this
That's very much like that.
yeah, it has this feeling that like, oh, these songs could fall apart at any second. And I feel like this song sort of has that as well. And I've always sort of felt that way. So it makes perfect sense that like it was very new to Dave as he was recording it.
Yeah, yeah. And it kind of adds for an intimacy, like a level of spontaneity that kind of becomes compelling. I mean, because even if you don't know that, I mean, you can, knowing it now, maybe you can hear it more if you kind of listen for his guitar part specifically, because it's like when it's the basis of all punk, really. Like how the majority of punk bands that start, a lot of the times, some of those young punk bands, they didn't know how to play their instrument really even before they started to play out and eventually record. So that's kind of what I mean by that kind of initial, intensity of that initial kind of uh, creation of that thing. There's a sincerity to that spontaneity
Yeah,
because it's not informed, it's not learned.
yeah, that's interesting. There really is a sense on this. I think this record as a whole, but like this song in particular, there is that sense of like, oh yeah, these are like what are they like 17, 18, 19 years old on this record?
Early 20s, I think.
Early 20s. Okay. Yeah, there definitely is that sense of like raw like being very young for recording a record like this. There is that like sincerity that I feel like definitely comes from that time in your life of playing music.
Right. But there's also this thing about this band and this album specifically, because I mean,
Mhm.
oddly enough, for being young 20 somethings when they're recording
Yeah.
this album, I mean, they've all kind of had a lengthy career. They've been in the music, like they've been making music for like a decade already, like
Hmm.
in other bands. Like they've been playing since they were 11.
That's
It's,
crazy.
yeah, it's ridiculous. It's so insane. But obviously they kind of graduated onto creating this thing that's, so much more interesting and kind of
Mhm.
involved than their early recordings with like Squirrel Bait and Maurice and whoever.
Yeah.
Um, but um, but I guess it's that like I was saying before, the even though like the majority of this record was so rehearsed, it was so kind of like ready to be put down,
Yeah.
that a little thing of like kind of incorporating somebody who didn't have something for the song yet to kind of just be like just throw them into the thing,
Yeah.
like like right into the fire, just do it, just do something, wing it, like that's kind of a intriguing thing, and it's very strange that it's contrary to their aesthetic. I mean, like Britt and Brian being the primary songwriters, to allow for that looseness into this project, like, after being so rehearsed, it's a very strange thing for them to have done, but to
Yeah.
good results.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. I had never thought of it like that. I'd always felt like this song was the like it it did have this like shakiness to it that I always really appreciated. But that's really interesting that because I didn't know how rehearsed they were for this record. I think you can kind of feel it because there is like I think a rigidity to a lot of this record,
Mm-hmm.
that does feel like people who have rehearsed these songs a million times. But yeah, this song doesn't feel that way, and it is sort of I think like kind of the centerpiece of the record in a lot of ways, which is
Sure.
interesting.
Yeah, probably even realistically track wise, because it's like the
Yeah,
end of the A side, if you were listening to this on vinyl.
right. Yeah, yeah. It is interesting that they would allow that to sort of be that resting place in the middle of the record.
Yeah, yeah. So now also in addition to this song, Brashear recalled, that's what's his name? Todd Brashear recalls that this song Dawn was the most time consuming of the songs that they laid down that weekend. Took 4 days to record this record, by the way. Um, what do you think was the most difficult task for Intercourse during your sessions for Halo Castration Institute?
That's interesting. We are lucky in the sense that a lot of our recording process has gone very smoothly. Um, Similarly, I think when we recorded Rule 36 a couple of years ago, maybe not 4 days, but I think collectively like a week that
Mm-hmm.
record was recorded. Um, but on the most recent record, I would have to say probably the last song was probably the most like time consuming, challenging because that song is essentially one riff that progressively slows down,
Hmm.
which was something that we had practiced that riff and gone, "That's a cool idea. We should do that." And then when it came to record it, we were all like, "Oh yeah, this is going to be like work because we've been practicing this riff as is." And so slowing it down progressively and like slowing down the click track was like a real challenge, I feel like.
Oh, but so because you were recording to a click as well, so that kind of adds to some disruption in the recording process. Because I don't even know how you would do that.
Yeah,
I mean, would the
from,
engineer have to literally turn like the BPMs like down as you are going, as the tape's rolling?
from what, yeah, we recorded it digitally. So from what I remember, obviously this is like, we recorded that record like a year and a half ago at this point. From what I remember, it was like, okay, we'll get through the song at this amount of BPM. There's a lot of stopping and starting in that song, so there are places where you could naturally just drop the BPM on it.
Okay.
But the way we recorded it was we didn't record it live, so it was drums first, which pretty common for a lot of recording.
Hmm.
So doing live tracking, but So it was basically like, all right, we'll play it at this BPM. We'll slow it down by X%. I don't remember what it was. It was basically until it was no longer feasible to keep time in that BPM.
Hmm.
It was a
Okay.
real like we had the idea for it, and it was a real like in a lot of ways a real like studio creation to get it to work. Um, so it was really just like punching in for those individual parts in a lot of ways, and playing at a slower BPM that, I mean, most of our songs are pretty fast. So playing at a BPM that slow was really counterintuitive for, I think, all of us.
Okay. Wow. Weird. Okay, I'm gonna have to listen to that again a little bit more thoroughly, or kind
Yeah.
of intimately, and kind of listen for that now, because
Yeah.
I don't think I picked up on that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's luckily, I think it came together well enough that it doesn't feel as choppy and as I sort of remember it being like when we recorded it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Very interesting story. I like that. Let's move on to the next song, Washer.
Hmm.
All right, so I have a long thing here, so bear with me, okay?
That's good. I think this
Um,
is the song that I had the least information for, probably.
oh, okay. I don't think I did either, really. But let's see what I got. According to songtell.com, this is a song about saying goodbye to a loved one and embracing the unknown and uncertain future.
Mhm.
The lyrics tell a story of someone who is leaving, and the narrator is trying to be strong and comfort the other. The narrator believes that one must wash oneself in their tears, trusting that faith and hope can build something new. The song is both a lament and a comfort, suggesting that no matter what happens, the feelings of love and connection will always remain.
Mhm.
Now, I'm starting to remember this song and a lot of the stuff that I had read about it.
Mhm.
Um, there's also something about like suicide. There's also something about this song being like this kind of like suicide note.
That's interesting. That I would have. That seems like one of those things that may, if I were to guess, came from that like myth making of the record,
Mm-hmm. Right.
where it feels like for a long time this band was like relatively like unknown in that way. Where I feel like on the internet at least there's a lot of, oh, this is a song about maybe suicide and who knows where these band members are now type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like was a very popular way of like contextualizing lost, well, maybe not lost is the right word, but sort of unknown music and even like other forms of media in that part of the internet.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I know what you mean. A lot of stuff that has been left up to interpretation, and over these years, everyone kind of chiming in with their own take on this and like whatever, and then plus the mystique of the band itself. No one having, for the longest time even known who the band is, never seen, haven't been able to see them live, never, not knowing where they are necessarily. Yeah, there's probably a lot of like, implying implementation of like, oh, maybe they died, maybe this was a suicide note and they killed themselves or whatever. Who knows? There's so much stuff that could have gone on.
Yeah, that's sort of how I think about it, is that there probably was some myth making there where it was like, this is probably the most compelling story about this band I could tell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see, keeping these ideas in mind.
Mm.
I know you are a fairly new member of Intercourse. um can you tell me about how you came to join the band and how you feel about being part of them now?
Yeah, so it was 2019. I had only been living in Worcester for a couple of months, I want to say, at the time. And Caleb, who I was friends with, called me and was like, "Hey, we need a fill in potentially for these dates." And like we had played shows together, and something that I always try to do at shows is, and Pete, the bass player who I've played in bands with for years, who is in Intercourse now as well,
Mhm.
um, have always tried to do is like try to make sure that we're on top of our shit, so to speak. And I think that's, if I were to guess, that's probably part of the reason why they asked me to join, because I was like, I could learn the songs quickly, and I'm not going to come at it like with a lot of ego, and I'm just going to make sure, I've got all my ducks in a row. So yeah, it was like 2019, it was like a fill-in situation, and they were like unsure of the future of the band at that point.
Hmm.
From what I understood, like I wasn't, super privy to a lot of that stuff. But shortly the after like probably like a year later, because obviously that was like mid to late 2019, everything went on hold for a good portion of 2020. I think by the time that like lockdown was over, we had all gotten together, um, all four of us, because Pete and I lived together at the time. And we weren't sure if it was even going to be intercourse at that point. We were just, because I think they were kind of burnt out,
Hmm.
which I think was partially why they were like, asking me if I would do it. And I was on board. And then we just came to a point where we're like, no, it would be silly to throw away that name at this point.
Right.
Like change the name, but some of the members are the same. And so we just decided like this was like somewhere in 2020, I think, maybe early 2021. It should just be intercourse.
Hmm.
And um, that was the period where we wrote Rule 36, and we wrote that record in. It went by like very fast, which is how we were like, oh yeah, we are doing the right thing. Once we decided like, oh, it should be intercourse. It shouldn't be like a new band with a different, aesthetic
Hmm.
or genre. We wrote all of those songs in like literally like 3 or 4 practices.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I think it was like really like we clicked very quickly, and it felt like shaking off the cobwebs of like other stuff that we were doing maybe that we weren't satisfied with, or just the fact that like we had to be in lockdown for so long, that we were all like ready to go.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And so how do you feel about being in the band now?
Oh yeah, I love being in this band. This is my favorite band that I have been in. There's very little ego in the band, which is nice. We all seem to be on the same page about like what moves we want to make, and even about the songs that we like make together. I feel like this happens to a lot of people. They're like, you'll come to the practice and you'll have an idea for a song, but not sure where it'll go necessarily. And you present it to the band, it sort of goes in a direction you didn't expect, and you sort of have that weird feeling about it.
Hmm.
I don't feel like I've ever felt that way. I feel like we're all pretty locked in sync as far as like musically and aesthetically, like where we want to be, which is a great feeling. Every time we go to do something like, oh, we're planning shows, we're recording an album, we're writing an album, it always goes suspiciously faster than we think it will. And I think it's because this probably leads to that cynicism. All of us have this like, oh, I know what this is going to be like from formative experiences of like playing with other people or writing with other people. You're like, oh, this is going to be like pulling teeth. And it never is for us. But we
Hmm.
always have that feeling that it might be just from past experience. It's,
Right.
it's really funny that we're like, this went well, like almost too well.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, excuse me. It's great that it is working out like that, and especially because I mean, you're a fairly new member to the band, and like you joined at a strange time, like just before the
Yeah.
pandemic, and then obviously have to go through a year of basically not being able to do anything together, I
Right.
guess, for the most part, and then so then you kind of pull through that, especially with what you're saying is like as far as like the band not necessarily even knowing if they wanted to kind of continue as this band.
Yeah.
It's like you were coming in at a very strange and kind of disjointed moment, and now you've kind of pulled through that and to be this kind of like unified band, which is just great. So cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way it worked out for us, because the band that I was in before, we were active prior to the pandemic, like pretty regularly, like a couple shows a month. Even though Pete and I had moved away in that period, and it's weird. It just kind of stopped. Like there was never any formal like I can't do this, like whatever. It just kind of fizzled out. And I think that probably speaks to like where everybody was mentally in that old band, where they were
Hmm.
just kind of done and maybe looking for the next thing. And I think Intercourse at that time like was that thing that I wanted to be doing, even if I didn't know at that time like what it would be.
Right. Yeah. Okay, great, man. Well, look, we're going to get into more about your band and your experience with being with them in one of the next songs. The song coming up now is For Dinner, which is actually just an instrumental song.
Right. Okay.
So nothing to say about this song just because the title alone doesn't give you much to work with, and then it's an instrumental, and I didn't find anything specifically about this song.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing to say about it really is that it kind of works as a great segue into the final song, Good Morning Captain. I mean, like we were saying earlier, first of all, the band, I guess, wrote in the liner notes of this album on the CD release that this should be listened to on vinyl. And kind of to what we were saying earlier, you know, with Don Amon being the kind of like perfect midpoint.
Yeah.
We started the B side with Washer. You have For Dinner as this instrumental kind of like interlude between the last two songs.
Mm-hmm.
And then now we have the final song, Good Morning Captain. So again, I have another kind of long thing to read here for you. It's a quote from Brian McMahon. And it reads, coming of age in Louisville was not easy. For all the liberties we enjoyed as kids, there's not a creative class. I was just trying to figure out, how am I going to do this? My father's father was a musician, great guy, but didn't seem to have two pennies together. Once I started leaving to do tours, my parents were not happy at all. My dad in particular was like, this is a huge mistake. I have a brother 5 years younger. I'm not saying Good Morning Captain's about him, but those lines, I'm sorry, I miss you, are informed by leaving Louisville and him behind. I was thinking about my brother having to go through the same experiences as me when everything was just becoming too much. I didn't even remember being sick. That whole part is just a blur. And I think that that is in regards to him actually getting physically sick after the recording of the vocals for this song.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Um, Not only have I heard this interpretation of the song more or less being about Brian's brother, but also about a loss of innocence in some ways.
I think that yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there is that feeling on this song that it does to me has always felt like a melancholy that's like very emblematic of that period of life where everything is changing. You have no idea who you are in relation to the world
Hmm.
and who you are really like I think in relation to like your family, what everything that you have known previously. It does really feel that way on that
Yeah.
song.
Yeah. I mean, and then kind of like just speaking to the last part that I was saying about how it kind of feels like a loss of innocence in a way. I mean, it's kind of I mean, these were young guys at the
Yeah.
time, so they're kind of coming to grips with their own kind of like coming of age thing and trying to kind of understand their place in the world, I guess. Um, Also, like a popular trend in today's parlance is FOMO, right? Fear of missing
Mhm.
out.
Yeah.
So, like he's saying about his brother, he was kind of afraid of like being in a band and being on tour, missing out on his brother's growing up and development and not being there for him. So he's having a fear of missing out, and in a way, if you're speaking to his if it's true that he what he's saying about the kind of it's kind of coming from um this inspiration of not being there for his brother.
Right.
Um,
That makes a
so
lot of sense.
yeah, so fear of missing out. I mean, is this a fear of yours being in a band, or are there anything, or
Hmm.
like, is there anything that you fear about being in a band?
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of musicians have that natural inkling of fear of missing out, especially as the longer that you're a musician and the more that you see like people in your peer group doing things that maybe you wish you were doing, like, oh, they're going on tour all summer. I wish I was doing that. Or, oh, they got this show with this bigger band. I wish I was doing that. That's something that I've always kind of felt, and I think always tried to fight against.
Hmm.
I definitely have that fear of missing out in a lot of ways, but I try to rationalize like that I have, that our band has its own path, it's doing its own thing. It's not going to look like what other people's progression is going to look like. It's definitely something that I have and I try to rally against as much as I can.
Sure. No, I mean, I understand that kind of like this this idea of like, are you living up to your fullest potential, especially when you see other people that are, doing essentially the same thing, being in
Yeah.
bands and so forth. But I mean, I don't know if Intercourse has ever gone on a major like national tour or something like that, like, have like a string of dates, like, 20 plus dates or more. But, being on the road for a long time would makes me think, and from my own previous experience,
Yeah.
you sometimes think about how, what are you missing at home? Like, am I missing out on like, my family's birthday parties and like,
Right.
nieces and nephews, and like what's happening at home that I'm missing, and does that affect you when you're out there on the road?
Yeah, that's really interesting. At least in my tenure in the band, we haven't done anything as long as like a 20-day type of thing. We usually, since we all work and Rick has a young kid, we're usually like a week or so here and there is usually what we can swing between work and
Hmm.
things.
Obligations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I'm sure for Rick having a young kid, that is absolutely the case of what's not happening when I'm there. I'm lucky in the sense that I have a relatively small family, so it's very easy to keep up to date with everybody. Um, I've never I have missed a few family obligations because of shows and touring and stuff. But it's never been something like catastrophic that I didn't feel like we could recoup in a little while.
Right. Right. Okay, so you haven't experienced that yet, which is good. I mean, good for you.
Yeah.
Because, it obviously does suck. I mean, like maybe when you guys reach that point where, maybe things work out where you're going to be on these extended tours or so forth, or maybe going across the pond to Europe to do some touring, which is a complete possibility, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, you might have if not you specifically, I mean, maybe even Tarek or anyone else in the band will have these moments of just kind of feeling like, it puts that strain on the romance that is, hey, I get to be in this great band and we're doing it and we're going on tour and playing these great shows. So
Right.
it's just one of those things. I mean, it's something, like I said, that luckily you haven't had to experience, but it might come at some point.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I'm sure like will be inevitable at some point. I think the most that I've personally experienced was, excuse me, uh the last time that we were on tour, we went all the way down to Atlanta, and over the course of that tour that we did, was my 30th birthday, and which was kind of nice because I'm not a big birthday celebrator, so it was kind of nice to have an excuse to not.
Have to acknowledge it.
Yeah, exactly. I just like could shoot people a couple of thank you texts instead of having to, be on the phone or do the whole like cake and presents thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes it works out in your favor. Yeah.
Yeah, that's generally the perspective I try to take on things like that, is that there may be things that I have to miss out on, like even if it's not something significant, like birthdays, holidays, it could be just time spent. The thing that I always try to put into context is like, while I may be missing those things, this is an opportunity that I may not get 10 years down the line, and I should take it while I can.
Absolutely. That's true. 100%. Well, so speaking of touring, I would say that we're done with this album, discussing this album, but you do have a tour coming up, right?
Yeah, we have a couple of tours coming up. We have next month, we're doing 3 dates with Chat Pile coming up next month.
Yeah, sweet.
Yeah, we're very, very excited for those. Those are, I think, the biggest venues we've played as a band so far.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, which is going to be very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, Chat Pile is the shit right now.
Yeah, yeah. Which I think is great. I mean, that record is so good. All those EPs are incredible as well. It's really great that it's like resonating with people in a way that I feel like it should. I think I felt this way, like, why don't more people know about this band? Why don't more people like this band? And I feel really excited that they are getting that acknowledgement that I feel like they should get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And then October we have a couple of dates coming up with Great Falls out of Seattle.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, those just got announced like last week, I think.
All right, great. And that's going to be in the area? Where are those going to be?
So the Chapel ones are Philadelphia, uh, Baltimore, and Boston, and then the other ones are oh geez, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll see you on Rhode Island then.
Yeah. I think we're playing Pawtucket.
Okay, I'll look for the venue. I'm not sure where it is right now, but I mean, if it's in Pawtucket, I know where it is. It's got to be
Yeah,
in one of two places.
exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, that's great. I'm looking forward to that then. I hope to see you there. And
Yeah, for sure.
the new record, can you tell me about the new record, where it's at now, where to get it and all that stuff?
Yeah, sure. The record is out on Learning Curve Records. You can find it on Learning Curve Records Bandcamp. I think it's on ours as well. I think we still have some vinyl copies of it left. I don't think we have a lot, but I think we have some. But regardless of that, you can find it Halo Castration Unit, Halo Castration Institute. My bad. You can find it any streaming service. I think it's available on.
Sure, but we want people to buy it. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, listen
yeah.
to it, fine. But I mean, we want people to pick up the vinyl and the cassette tapes even you got, right?
Yeah, I think we might still have some of those left. There were not a ton of them. Those were through Red Scroll Records out of Connecticut.
Okay, cool.
I think we might have some of those left too.
All right. Well, either way, we hope people show up at the shows and see you guys perform live with Chat Pile or Great Falls and, and pick up some merch. We always encourage that.
Yeah, no, please do.
Great, man. Hey, well, Sean, it's been a pleasure getting to know you better, man.
Yeah, you as well, man. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.